Well, welcome to the November 2023 version of the Economist Board. I'm John Nelson with Morris Nelson and Associates, M&A, and I'm joined today by Keith Prather of Armada. How you doing today, Keith?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Ready to talk economics and modeling and all that fun stuff.
That sounds fun. You've really teed that up. So we're going to read. I know wives right now around the world are really wait, just hanging on with bated breath. Okay. So for some of you don't know, but we're rolling out a new report. It's called The Watch. It's a reformat of what we've done and refocusing on what we've done in the past. And accordingly, we're going to change up how we do our videos. This video, our first one, is going to be similar to the last ones where we're going to focus on overall industrial production for manufacturing, but we're also going to do a little bit of highlight of the subsectors. And then for our subscribers, rather than going through a litany of a lot of individual sectors, we're going to dive deeper into the subsectors in a separate single video, subsectors of manufacturing, that is. If you're not a subscriber, by the way, sign up for a free trial through the webpage. That's the paid political announcement that, as you can tell, I needed a new tongue to get out of my mouth. But we're also going to introduce a couple new videos this month on the construction sector and a macroeconomic and a retail look. Keith and I were talking before, consumer spending 70% of overall GDP. And makes it pretty obvious why we need to discuss it. And we capture the majority of that in our retail forecast. So with that absolutely eloquent introduction, Keith, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I mean, you put two mathematicians together and this is what you get, right?
Boy, you're just teeing up the excitement.
I am, man. Ready to rock and roll.
Okay. Well, let's kick it off with industrial production for manufacturing. And I'm going to go ahead and see if I can make Zoom do what it is supposed to do and show my screen. And did I show the right screen?
Yep, you're good.
All right. That's what I needed to know. You can never tell. Okay. So what I'm seeing and what the model's showing me, Keith, we've talked about it a bunch. We've got this little bit of a surge coming on for the next few months, takes us out to about halfway, or actually through the end of first quarter into the second quarter, and then it starts really trailing off for about the next almost 12 months, where it really trails off pretty hard. And we see a little bit of signs of recovery at the very end, but that's so far outside, kind of suspect. But the bottom line, the story is, and you're going to see it kind of repeated in some of the subsectors, is that little bit of an increase and then a trailing off.
Yeah, and if you want to go to the next slide, I think we can see it a little bit better on a historical basis there. There we go.
Absolutely. So, long term. Now, when we talk about trailing off, we're not talking about trailing off below, really historic trailing off or historic levels, but it is still significantly below the trend line at the end of this, if we're right.
Yeah, and so yeah, it's not a recession look, at least for the sector, but it is concerning that we're not getting the kind of growth in the second half of next year that we would expect. And I'm gonna throw this out there, John. I would expect that as we start to update these models every single month, we get brand new economic data and we update them going into the end of the year and early next year. I have a feeling the tail end of this curve may change a little bit. And I think a little bit of that peak may come off just a little bit. So the backdrop is that we've talked about this before, but a lot of companies in the US are still very overstocked on inventories and they're sitting way too heavy going into the peak retail season. And that's slowing down a lot of manufacturing activity. Some of the latest data that we have shows that a lot of customers and manufacturers are sitting so heavy on inventory that they've stopped new ordering. And that they're going to try and get a lot of sell-through going into the first quarter of next year. So it's kind of put a little bit of sluggishness in manufacturing, which is what you're seeing in the current data.
Mm-hmm.
But the model's a little more optimistic. The model's kind of saying that there's a little bit of reacceleration kind of early next year. And I tell you where I think it's coming from. We do have the automotive sector that looks like it's probably going to be rebounding. And then on the consumer goods side of things, a lot of major retailers like Walmart, Target, Dollar General, a lot of those companies have really got their inventories under control. And in fact, they're sitting about 22% lighter this year than they were last year. And so they're going into the peak retail season with a fairly strong consumer, at least a consumer that's still spending right now, whether they've got the cash or not. Um, and I think we're going to get good depletion of inventories going into the end of the year, which means we get that Q1 replenishment cycle started, which we didn't have much of last year. And I think that's what the model's reading into the data. And that's why I think you see a little bit of a higher peak for manufacturing activity, especially across the consumer goods sector, which this particular model covers both durables and
Mhm.
non-durables. And I think that's why you get that surge here. But it is picking up pressure in the back end of that curve that we don't hear in a lot of economic forecasts. So you and I are using data, and we're trusting the data, we're trusting the models. The performance of this model has been very good. And we'll show that to you a little bit later in this video, but we've got to trust the data a little bit. And so it's throwing us some pretty negative signals going into the second half of next year and early into 2025. And so that's a little bit concerning, right? It's not what we
Yeah.
see in every subsector, and that's why it's important for you to dive in and see what's happening in those individual sectors, especially ones that may affect you. And I'll just tell you this one last little anecdote. We are getting the what we call flash reports. So they're manufacturing surveys that are conducted every single month around the world. We get them from all the major countries that the United States trades with. And the flash report is when we have about 80% of the surveys in, and we start to get kind of a preliminary look. And it was a little bit concerning because we're starting to see some layoffs in the manufacturing sector. We're seeing new orders tanking, and we're seeing optimism about the next 6 months also waning.
Mm.
Optimism hit a low that we haven't seen since last July. So, so basically, what the model is kind of telling us is that maybe we get a little more optimistic going into early next year than maybe what people are thinking. We see a little better activity, but followed up by maybe a surprise in the second half of next year. At least that's what it's telling us at the moment.
Okay, so let me throw something at you then. Noise or chatter? The impact of the Israeli-Hamas conflict right now on industrial production.
Okay, so two things. The defense sector, when we break down durable goods and you look at just the defense sector alone, aircraft orders are a little more sluggish, but they have a much longer procurement rate, right? So you don't just suddenly wake up some morning and realize that you need a bomber, right?
Yeah.
There's a longer procurement cycle, but what we do see is an absolute surge in the production of munitions, missiles, some of the stuff that we are sending to at least two different theaters. And I know that we're helping backfill a lot of our European allies with equipment. And so we see month over month defense spending on durables, or what we would consider to be the munitions sector, up 25% month over month, and then for the full year up almost 40%. So tremendous amount of spending there. And where we get the impact on that, John, is in the manufacturing sector. You think about things like we're competing for copper, and we're competing for different types of precious metals. Some of the titaniums, and some of the aluminums, and some of those materials that are going into those munitions, lead. We're competing against the defense sector for that in the private sector. And so you see a little more stability in the commodity markets than maybe what we should be getting because of that. And then the last piece of it, John, is that some of the rebuilding activity, if you go look at photos of what's happened in Ukraine and some of the cities and the devastation there, and you look at what's happened in Syria over the last 5 to 6 years with the war in Syria, you look at what happened in Turkey with the earthquake, you look at what's happening in Gaza, and Israel has already procured and already talked to construction firms to go in and start rebuilding after the October 7th event. And so you've already got construction activity happening there. We know Turkey's already rebuilding. And so you've got kind of this global surge in a little bit of construction activity. And so that filters back through and starts to ripple back through the supply chain, feeding, the manufacturing engine. And so we do see a little bit of that already starting to happen. So chatter, is it noise or is it real? Well, they're
Yeah.
elements of it. They're very real, creating very real economic activity. But is it as big as we thought it was going to be? As big as we feared? Not yet. Not yet.
You mentioned the demand on copper and some of the other primary metals, so I want to take a look real quick at that. If you see if I can get the primary metal here to come up. There we go. No, that's not it.
That's not it.
That is not it. That is rail freight intermodal.
There you go.
Let's see if we can get it to come back to primary metal 30. There we go.
There we go.
It did not like what I was doing. There we
It
go.
did not, but people got a sneak peek of something brand new that we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
So there's primary metal, and primary metal, kind of a little bit different than IPMAN. You're seeing kind of the same shape, but it's a different timing. The primary metal, where we started to see that wane or that trailing off in the IPMAN falling off at around the big end of first quarter of next year. You're seeing this strength stay all the way up until through third quarter and then start tailing off. What do you make of this? And do you want me to jump right to the long-term look?
Yeah. Let's go to long-term real quick. And we'll just use that as a backdrop. So you can kind of see that surge. It's crazy. It's a crazy surge.
It's a big surge.
It is a big surge. Okay, so in the category of crazy shtick, right? There's some things happening right now around the world. They're kind of nuts. So we already talked about the defense sector. And we talked about what's happening in to the primary wars and some of the rebuilding activity that's kind of ongoing. But in China right now, President Xi is trying to stimulate the economy. And in the past, they built these cities or out in the middle of nowhere that no one really would go occupy. And so you've kind of got an overbuilding of some of this commercial construction space or commercial office space. Sorry. What he's doing this time, though, is he's going in and he's building infrastructure. So he's starting these infrastructure projects, roads, highways, bridges, super highways, elevated rail systems, all kinds of different types of infrastructure to stimulate economic activity. And what's interesting is it's created sort of this global demand for commodities, things like rebar and cement and all those things that go into infrastructure. We're seeing this weird surge in demand. There's a thing called the Baltic Dry Index, and the Baltic Dry Index measures the cost to move bulk materials, things that would go into the primary metal category, and it measures them across the 25 busiest global trade lanes in the world. And that particular index, we've seen a 50% surge in the cost and the movement of those raw materials just in the last 30 days.
Wow.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And so something's happening. Somebody is starting to procure and move raw materials around the world. Some of it is people are out there discount and bargain buying, and some of the commodities are a little bit cheaper than they have been over the last couple of years. And so there's a little bit of opportunistic buying taking place. But the forecast here, fascinating, because this is about, this is not 30 days old, but but the data itself was forecasting this surge before we started to see it in things like the Baltic Dry Index. So it gives me some confidence in what we're seeing in the actual model itself. So this highly optimistic surge here, yeah, it doesn't surprise me. And so I think it's interesting, and I think it'd be pretty exciting for anyone in this category.
And it is. We talk about, boy, that is a big surge, but if you look in historically, it isn't entirely unprecedented. So all you have to do is look back at 2006 to 2008, and there you have a surge of equal magnitude.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not unprecedented. And we could see that top soften a little bit, obviously, as we move forward and, we get brand new data. Right now, the global economy with 2 ongoing wars and some of the challenges that we've got, it's volatile. Let's just be honest. It's volatile. We there's a lot of moving parts right now. And the nice thing about models and what gives us value here is that the data kind of sees through a lot of the noise and a lot of the chatter. And it kind of becomes a little bit of the truth serum that we need to take from time to time, so we're not running on hysteria. So
let's bring this in a little bit closer in the supply chain, and let's talk about fabricated metals real quick. And again, you're seeing the same sort of thing, but notice the tail's even a little bit further pushed off. Like primary metal, pretty much begins a little bit of a tapering there in third quarter of 24. but certainly not quite as steep as what we've seen in that primary metal category. Now, what I will tell you is that that far out, when you get that far out on some of these models, you know, it's the accuracy, the precision starts fading away. So we just got to kind of put that out there. So I expect some changes there at that far distant end, but the overall trend, how it looks, is probably going to remain pretty close to true.
Yeah, and that peak may soften just a little bit. It may flatten out a little bit. I mean, that's kind of historically what we've seen
Yeah.
as we get more stable data. And by stable, I mean, the last 2 years, things have just been so volatile. Again, you've started a war. We've had this global supply chain challenge. We're coming off of COVID, and there's so many different things in the data that was kind of creating noise. And so we're still seeing a little bit of that flattening, a little bit of the adjusting of the data. And you and I, this is crazy, and I'm not going to get political about it, but there's some crazy things happening with the Federal Reserve and some of the data that they're cranking out.
Sure.
Some of the magnitude of revisions that I've seen in the data that they're releasing is staggering. I had a client the other day, John, where we were looking a month ago. I was showing them federal data that showed the particular category we were looking at showed a 14% year over year increase. This month, we get brand new data. And I went back and looked at the data from last month, and it got revised. It went from a 14% year over year growth rate to a 2% year over year growth rate. I mean, as a business owner, how do you manage with that?
Yeah. How do you work with that?
How do you work with that? Yeah, because on one hand, you're thinking, oh my gosh, we got to go higher and we got to expand and we got to get ready to accommodate this growth. And wow, that's fantastic. And then you get this revision, and you're like, oh my gosh, we're chasing our tail. This isn't real, and so anyway, the models kind of help smooth some of that volatility in the data out because of the way we do it. And
Yeah, I was going to ask, why should, if the data or the example you gave is a difference between 14% one month and 2% the next in terms of growth rate, why should anybody trust us?
yeah, well, and it's because of the rigor that I think you've put into this system. And it's looking at historical cycles. It's taking a lot of things into consideration. It's not just one data point, and that's the risk in weighing in and looking at one data point and trying to make decisions off that one data point. This thing, I mean, we've looked at 18 to 20 different economic metrics in each one of these models, dated over 23 years of performance. And using some pretty advanced, modeling techniques to be able to cut through that noise and cut through that volatility to try and figure out what's really happening. And so, at least that's my explanation for it. You probably have a better one.
Well, I was going to say that kind of parrot off. You had mentioned the rigor. There is rigor in there, but you mentioned the 18 to 20 some odd economic indices. How did we pick those? Well, that goes back to over 20, 30, 40 years of experience of you and your partner, Chris Kuehl, picking, what indices should we take a look at and try to boil into these models. And so let's talk about the accuracy of these things.
Yeah.
I don't think we're doing too bad, but I want to point out, we look at the accuracy out 6 months. We don't go much further than that. It's going to fall off after 6 months, but at least out 6 months, I think a business owner has a good idea what he can look at.
Absolutely. And it was interesting because I was listening to the Federal Reserve, and Fed Chairman Powell said that they look at basically two different types of data, but the one thing that they love is they love the 6-month view on most economic data that they're watching, the 6-month trend. And so, it's one of the reasons why we kind of chose that 6-month window. And what's interesting too is I'll say this: you and I, not to try and toot our own horns here, right? But for us, acceptable is anything with a 9 handle on it, right? If we're 90% or higher in our accuracy, we're feeling pretty good about the model. We're really shooting for 95 or higher on everything, even 6 months out. So we'll look at something like motor vehicles and parts, and even with all the volatility with the UAW strike and some of those things that are happening that the models would not technically pick up, as those events happen, it's still batting 85% 6 months out. And so it's, and 98% 3 months out. So even with some of that noise and volatility in there, we're still pretty accurate on it. The other thing I would say is that we don't do this, and this is a little bit of an ad, but I want to explain to people who are subscribing to this. We don't go in and do what a lot of other companies will do, and I'm not going to mention any names, but they'll typically say, my forecast is that this particular index will be 100, and then within a 95% confidence interval, if it comes in at 105 or it comes in at 95, well, that's within that 95% confidence interval, and so we were 100% accurate. We don't do that, right? We don't do that. You go in and you literally say, we said it was going to be 103.4, and how far off were we from 103.4? And that's how we derive our accuracy. Okay, so enough of an ad. Let's go in and just talk real fast, because we are doing another video. It is behind the paywall.
Yep.
Again, if you're not a subscriber, go in and just get a free trial. We're not going to chase you. Don't ask you for a credit card, but go in and check out the individual subsectors, because the next video we're doing, we're going to cover aerospace, computer and electronic products, electrical equipment, fab metals, machinery, motor vehicles and parts. And we already did fab metals, so we won't do that in the next one, but we're going to cover those subsectors. And I can tell you that two of the sectors we're seeing probably weaker performance than we expected out of the models. The models are calling for probably an outlook that right now is not publicly being talked about. And specifically, aerospace is one of those where we've got odd weakness, even though order demand in that industry is pretty strong. The others are giving us probably the opposite, giving us some pretty optimistic outlooks, which are pretty good. So again, dive in and go get that detail, and check out those videos. So,
All right. Well, I think that's our rundown at the high level.
yeah.
And we gave you the shameless plugs multiple times in this video, but we're pretty proud of what we've done, and hope you agree that it's useful. So anyway, until we see you again, take care.
Next month. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.